piece of cake. And I got thinking about it this morning. I said, man, that's weird. But I have a mic on this morning, too, and it's aggravating me. So I think one of the complaints last week was the sound. I'm going to try to speak loud because we're spread out. That's usually not a problem for me. It's good to see people in person in Sunday school instead of on Zoom. It's been kind of funny teaching yourself to teach to a computer. You said just look at your computer screen and speak to a computer screen. That's been a little different. I'm a people person. I'm not liking this, not handshaking and hugging and being close to people, but I'm getting used to it little by little. I get to the golf course yesterday, and I told myself, I'm just riding by myself. Give me a cart by myself, I'll pay extra. I didn't want to ride with. I feel like I'm getting unsociable, but it is good to be here and see everybody. A lot of our regular folks, it's good to see our regular class, but we got several people visiting this morning, or they've been around a little bit to our church maybe, but first time in our class. It is good to see old friends Rhonda and Jeremy Verrett. I remember them back in the Beacon Baptist days when we went there. Amy Rose, Martha's sister's with us. Thank you for being here. David and Stephanie Johnson and Stephen Moret Campbell. It's good to have y'all with us this morning. Hope we don't scare you away, and I promise one day we'll be back to having a tighter knit group in here, and it is a great Sunday school class, and I've missed fellowshipping with my Sunday school class. It's, don't tell the preacher, but he'll probably he may look at this, but being in Sunday school is one of my favorite parts of the week, just being with my Sunday school friends, and I mean my best friends really fall into this class, and it's just great to be back in person. We do have an announcement. One thing, Wednesday morning around lunchtime, a little bit before lunchtime, is when we're going to try to do our public safety lunch thing that we're going to carry food to all three of our fire departments, and the EMS stations here are stationed at our fire departments and to our police department. It's up in the air where we'll take it at the police department. They're supposed to move in their new digs this week, so we may take it at the old place or the new place. We'll figure it out. They'll let me know Tuesday on that. We'll need some volunteers. Larry's going to send something out this afternoon on email about how many people we think we might need and what we might be doing. But we'll divide up the food, go out to the places we need to go to. So that's all in way of announcements. I do want to get into our lesson this morning as we finish in Esther this morning. We'll be in chapters 7 and 8 if you want to turn to the book of Esther. That's where we find ourselves. I don't know about you, but I have really enjoyed this short study in Esther. As Larry and I have complained the entire time of this series we've been in, covering 3 and 4 chapters at the time has not been what I would like to do. I'd much rather taken a closer look. There's a lot of good things in these chapters we've covered. But when I last taught 2 weeks ago, I left you with Esther giving Mordecai instructions to have the Jewish people of the city of Shushan enter into 3 days of fasting. They didn't say prayer, but prayer is, if you read it, ever studied the Old Testament, prayer is assumed when people go into is prayer and fasting. And so that's what she'd asked her people to do, and they went into 3 days of prayer and fasting. That's where I left that lesson. Then last week, Brother Larry picked up in chapters 5 and 6 in a lesson entitled Esther's Plan Unfolds. After the prayer and fasting, a plan unfolded for Esther of what she thought could be done. And we saw that after that time, she got an audience with the king. She requested an audience before the king. That request was granted. And her simple request was to prepare a banquet for the king and for the evil Haman, who we introduced a few weeks ago as being the villain in this whole story. And of course, we probably read or studied where Haman was elated that he was so important that he was being invited to a special banquet with the king and queen. And as he returned home to celebrate this good news, once again he passed Mordecai at the gate of the city, and Mordecai again refused to bow, refused to show him the reverence that Haman thought he deserved, and that again infuriated Haman. Infuriated him to the point that he goes home, gets with his family, and they hatch a plan and they erect a gallows that we'll find is 50 cubits high that they were going to they were going to hang Mordecai on. So that's how angry he was. But of course, we saw in the story last week that God had other ideas. And that very night, the king had his attention drawn to the fact that it was Mordecai who had once saved him from an assassination attempt. And so you'll recall that the king wanted to reward Mordecai. And so in his trusted prime minister, or whatever you want to call him, he came in to into his presence, he asked Haman, says, if you have somebody you want to honor, what would you do? And of course, Haman, the self-assured person that he was, thought the king was talking about him. So he comes with all these elaborate plans of robes and crowns and special honors that should be bestowed upon this person. Then the king said, hey, great idea. I want to honor Mordecai. See to it that this happens. Well, that kind of had to take the wind out of Haman's sails, So the tables had begun to turn against him. And last week's lesson ended with Haman going home, lamenting to his family the fact that Mordecai, the person that he hated more than anybody in the world, was now going to be honored. And at the time he's there lamenting this fact, a messenger from the king shows up and reminds him of his appointed banquet with the king and queen. So that's where we stopped last week's lesson and where we'll pick up this morning. So we'll start right off reading the first few verses of chapter 7 of Esther. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. We'll start right there for a minute. If you're Haman, hearing this, you got to know that Esther is holding a pretty strong hand of power right now. I mean, the king is just, hey, I'll give you half the kingdom. Whatever do you want? So continue. Then Esther, the queen, answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. And if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So as the banquet starts here, we see Esther, who is still very favored by the king, and the king asks her what's her petition. Esther is very discreet and honorable here. She's very respectful of the king. She doesn't want to mess up this role that she's on, I guess, that the king has given her such honor. And she tells the king that her people have been sold to be destroyed and to be slain. She clearly indicates that she too is included in this group who is marked for destruction. She pointed out that they had been marked for destruction, that her people would be destroyed, and when this happened, that it would be a great loss for the king as well and for the kingdom. We see that she was very careful not to bring up the king's unwitting hand in this entire mess that they found themselves in the decree and the death warrant that had been issued. So we continue on. I like the part that the subtitle of this part of the lesson is called Haman's Terror. I want you to think about Haman for a minute. He's had this plan. It's been in place for about 2 months now. We're about 9 months away from it being executed, that all the Jews in the 127 territories or provinces are going to be killed. So here's Haman. Everything's going according to plan. He's going to wipe out the hated Jews. He's going to wipe out Mordecai. And all of a sudden, Esther up and tells the king what is up, and the king seems very interested in what she's got to say. And it's called Haman's Terror. If you were Haman, you have to be having butterflies, at least in your stomach. I'd be said, I think I need to leave the banquet and run and hide, but he has to set through here. So let's see what happens next. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. The Bible uses the word in the King James, afraid. Personally, I would write terrified. I don't know what I would write if I was writing this, because he had to be terrified. The wording in verse 5 leads us to see that the king may have been oblivious to what was going on right under his nose. He seemed shocked and surprised that someone was involved in a plot to kill his queen. It did not seem to register that the one he decided to recently bestow honor upon, Mr. Mordecai here, was also marked for death. The king asked Esther, as we see in the verses we read, who is responsible for such a thing? The wording of the verse makes it sound like, who would dare to harm a hair on my queen's head? Who would dare to do such a thing? Well, the tables have really turned. Haman is right there, present at the banquet when this is said. And as I said, can you imagine how uncomfortable, how terrified he had to be at this point? Then as verse 6 tells us, Esther makes the accusation, points the finger at Haman, and she fittingly described him as an adversary, as the persecutor of her people. She further described him as what we've called him all for the last few weeks, a very wicked man. The Bible says all that needs to be said at this point to describe Haman's reaction. He was afraid, terrified, and rightfully so. Verse 7 tells us that the king arose from the banquet of wine in his wrath and went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw there was an evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. The unfolding of these events, of this plot, apparently angered the king against his once trusted right-hand man. Conveniently, the king had either forgotten or ignored his own hand in this matter, because it was he that had given the signet ring to Haman. It was he that approved anything that Haman did. But in his rage, he goes into the palace gardens. It doesn't say, but I'm presuming to cool off or to get his thoughts together or figure out what he's going to do next. It appears that Haman thought this was his last chance for mercy, and he begged for mercy with the queen, who currently had the favor of King Ahasuerus. The bed of the queen described here in the Bible, that was described as Haman fallen upon, was actually probably a dinner couch that they recline in around the dinner table in Old Testament time, and the queen was apparently reclining upon it. But as Haman was apparently kneeling or at the feet of the queen on this couch, the king returns to the banquet hall. The king implies that it appears now that Haman was attempting to sexually assault the queen. That's kind of the inference that's given from those verses. But at this point, we don't know what the signal was. It doesn't say. But the king's servants covered the face of Haman, which signified that he would not see the king's face anymore. This was a signal for Haman to die for his misdeeds. I like this part. Verse 9. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, also the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was pacified. It kept getting worse for Haman, because as soon as he's identified, as soon as they cover his face, one of the king's servants informs the king that a gallows had been erected in his own yard on the property that Haman lived at or that he owned, that he had made with the intention to hang Haman. What I think is neat about this with this chamberlain or this servant of the king quickly pointing out the gallows that stand in Haman's yard, if you go back several weeks when we read that when the edict went out to kill the Jews or destroy the Jews, I remember wording in the verse that the city of Shushan was perplexed. It didn't say the Jews. It said the city. It just struck me that not everybody in the country wanted to wipe the Jews out. They'd been living together beside each other for years. This was the work of an evil man who was going to take out his what he wanted to do, regardless of what anybody else wanted to do. And it just strikes me that as soon as Haman is on the ropes, you got to serve it. Hey, King, I got an idea. We got gallows right down here on Haman's property that he's erected to kill Mordecai, the one you want to honor. It just struck me that it showed that not everybody in the land who was a non-Jew wanted to see the Jews killed. I think Haman must have been so evil that even his own people recognized. The Jews knew he was evil, but his own people recognized it. He pointed out that the gallows were 50 cubits high, about 75 feet. I think that's what that works out to. And the king ordered Haman to die on these very gallows. So the Bible tells us he was executed there. In all probability, when you think about it, 75 feet is pretty high for him to be hanging from. So you got to assume that all of his family and friends, any supporters of Haman, had to at least see this man's end because of his attempted reign of terror. We'll move on into chapter 8. On that day, did King Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, to Esther the queen, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. On the day that Haman was hanged, King Ahasuerus gave Haman's estate, his property, his riches, his wealth, to Queen Esther. And then the Bible tells us that Mordecai was brought in before the king, and Queen Esther now explains to the king her relationship with Mordecai. We see in verse 2 that the king did similarly to Mordecai what he had once done to Haman. He moved him into that same position, basically like being second in command. Again, our lesson writers liken it to being like a prime minister. And now Mordecai held the same position that Haman had. He gave him the signet ring that once was possessed by Haman. And at this point, we see that the queen then honored her foster father by giving him the estate of Haman that had been given to her by the king. What we see as this thing unfolds and how the tables turn, to Haman, who was at one point public enemy number one in Haman's eyes. He was probably marked to be the first to die in Haman's eyes. He was going to kill all of Mordecai's people because of Haman's hatred for Mordecai. Now we see Mordecai assuming the same position that Haman had. We see Mordecai in a position of wealth, in a position of power, and in a position of leadership. He's now a man favored by the king of Persia, and he's in a position to do much good. But Esther's not finished yet. We see in verse 3, and Esther spoke yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it please the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and this thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come to my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Even though everything seems to be going really good at this very moment for Queen Esther and for Mordecai, there's still the problem with the death decree that was still in effect. It was a royal decree with the signet of the king on the decree. Verse 3 tells us Queen Esther once again falls at the feet of the king. And we see once again the king gives her favor and allows her to make yet another petition. So she begs the king to reverse this royal decree that was devised by Haman, which in effect put the Jews under a destruction order. She asked the king how could she endure this evil and destruction that was scheduled to come upon her people. So we see the king's answer here in 7 and 8. So the king, Ahasuerus, said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Verse 7, the king reminds Esther of all that he's done to punish the evil Haman and to reward Esther. This was not said in an effort to say, hey, I've already done enough. It was an effort to assure Queen Esther, I'm willing to do whatever I can do to help you with this. Verse 8, we see the king instruct Mordecai that he and Esther could write what they wanted to write on the behalf of the Jews, and further, they could put it in his name and seal it with his ring. That would make it an irreversible decree. However, there's still a problem. The decree that Haman had prepared, that had been given the royal seal, was also an irreversible decree. So whatever Mordecai and Esther come up with cannot violate this previous order or decree. So we'll see in the next few verses what is done here, starting with verse 9. Kind of a long passage here, so bear with me as we run through it. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, and to every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing, and according to their language. And he wrote in King Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, to cause to perish all the power of the people in the province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the writing for commandment to be given in every province was published unto all the people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. Verse 9:12 tells us on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, Mordecai called in all the royal scribes to start writing down a new decree. 2 months had passed since Haman had issued the death decree. The next few verses go into detail telling how Mordecai prepared the decree, how he stamped it with the royal seal of the signet ring, and how he got it out to all 127 provinces in the kingdom. In verse 11, we see what the new order or the new decree actually orders. As we stated before, under their law, the previous order calling for the death or the killing of Jews could not be annulled. But it could be counteracted, and that's what Mordecai did. The new decree authorized Jews in every city and every province in the kingdom to gather and organize themselves for self-defense. This meant they could arm themselves. This meant they could plan strategy of how to protect themselves. And while the decree did not allow the Jews to attack anyone, it did allow them to defend themselves by killing their attackers without any fear of official reprisal from the government. The decree even allowed the Jews to kill the women and children of any attacker and to take all of their spoils from them after killing them. And the day, I think it's kind of neat, the way he wrote it, the day the decrees would take effect was on the same date that Haman's murderous decree was to take place, which was on the 13th day of the 12th month. We'll finish up reading what we have to read this morning, starting with verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, blue and white, and with a crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people in the land became Jews, and the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Looking at the last few verses in our lesson this morning, we see that, again, a reminder of how Mordecai had been raised from a position of sure death, sitting in the gate in sackcloth and ashes, knowing that death was going to come upon him and his people, to basically being the second highest office holder in the land, with all the royal trimmings that went with it. Verse 15, the Bible tells us that the city of Shushan rejoiced. It doesn't say that just the Jews rejoiced. It said the city rejoiced. And that makes me go back to when the city was perplexed when the death decree came out. So the Jews were obviously glad that they looked like they had been delivered. But it seems that the non-Jews were relieved as well, as this had been a plot by one man and his closest followers, but probably not the entire nation. And in verse 17 lets us know that in the land there was an awareness that the Jews had risen from the brink of destruction to a position of power in the kingdom. The last few words we read indicated that they feared the Jews. And get this, that some actually became Jews, converted from some paganism to Judaism. What a turn of events in just a few days. But with every good story, there's an epilogue. There's a little bit more to add. Our lesson series ends with verse 17 of chapter 8. But if we had one more lesson, we'd go into chapter 9. I don't have time to go into it like I would for a regular lesson, but we'll touch on it here. Chapter 9 reports that the date of the death decree and the date of the self-defense decree, for lack of a better word, comes to pass on the 13th day of the 12th month. And not many of the non-Jews did anything. They were glad that, hey, if I attack, I get killed. So they kind of counteracted. With Mordecai in power, the government was in support of the Jews, and the citizens recognized the power that the Jews had and that Mordecai had. But chapter 9 tells us that some attacked anyway. There's some people that are going to do wrong because they're going to do wrong. There's just no, they were given it out. You don't have to go kill the Jews because you put your own life at peril, but there's some who are just evil. And we live among people like that today, that no matter what is hanging over their head, they're going to still do evil. And it says that 75,000 enemies of the Jews were slain on that day, including the 10 sons of Haman. In fact, Haman's sons were hanged on the very gallows that their father was hung on and that had been constructed to kill Mordecai and certainly other Jews. The fact that Haman's sons were hanged from the gallows was a testimony that justice had prevailed in the land. I think Larry and I have covered how the mighty hand of our God was present in this great old story from the Bible. I think we made it clear early on that this is one of those books of the Bible where any of the names of God that we know are not used. We don't see them. We don't see Jehovah. We don't see Elohim. We don't see God. We don't see that word. But man, the emphasis is clear that God is all over this. His hand is all over this chapter. It's clear how God orchestrated the twists and turns so that certain people were in certain places at certain times. How did Esther become queen? How did this Jewish woman all of a sudden, out of all the women in the kingdom, how did she become queen? I don't know about you, but God's hand was in that. God knew what was going to happen, and he was setting the stage for how he would deliver. We saw a very brave and very smart woman in the form of Esther boldly act on behalf of God's people. Well, where did the boldness come from? Go back to when they went into the days of prayer and fasting. God gave her that boldness. Maybe not something she had on her own, but God gave it to her. We saw a man of conviction in Mordecai who fearlessly acted on God's behalf. And when all was said and done, and this plot came to an end, we see that God had raised a leader who was intelligent, who was effective, and who was be able to use his position for good. I mean, it took some thinking at that time to come up with a decree that could counteract the other decree without annulling it. We see a man of intelligence. We see a man of leadership. He wasn't in his place by accident either. Then we see God's hand cause a godless king to allow himself to be influenced by God's people to the point that while he was not converted, he still essentially caused no harm to God's people. God's hand is all over this book and this short story. It's a great story. I mean, it's just fun to read. I mean, I really enjoy reading it. But it's a great story of God's hand, God's providence, God's controlling of circumstances, the unseen hand of God that we can't see, but he is controlling circumstances. And I think because of that the book of Esther can be of great encouragement to you and me this morning. I believe that many of you have to be like me and are concerned about our country right now. And I'm not talking about the virus and we're all concerned about that too. I mean, I walk in with a mask when I walk in this morning, but let's not even talk about that. I'm talking about the political temperature of our country right now. Things that are happening from one end of our country to the other. We got probably the most hateful and contested election coming up that I've ever seen in my life. And look, I was a political science major when I was in college. I love to follow politics and what's going on. I can't watch it right now. And I've always been a junkie on it, and I can't hardly watch it. That's how bad it is. We're concerned about this thing. And we see more and more of these primaries and these elections being won and people assuming leadership roles in our federal, our state, our local governments who do not support Christian values, who dislike or hate the nation of Israel, who openly support the nation of Islam, and some who directly hate or severely dislike Bible-believing Christians like you and I. I know it's not good sometimes to mix politics and government and Bible teaching. I think we should stick with the Bible when we're in here. I try not to get up here and talk about current events a whole lot, except maybe to try to make an example. But this story put forth in Esther is all about politics and government, if you read the story on its face. We see a man named Haman work his way into a position of power in a governmental system under King Ahasuerus, just like people work themselves into power and position powers in our governmental systems. There's no difference. They get in, they weasel in, the next thing you know, they have power, and then all the evil that's in their heart gets to be made into law. And once in power, he undertook to do harm to God's people. And do not believe that's not happening today. I'm not going to call names, but I clearly remember a certain U.S. senator in a confirmation hearing openly attack an appointee simply because he had Bible-based beliefs. In fact, as I recall, I can't recall his exact words, he made it clear that he did not think a guy like this was fit to hold any official governmental office in the land simply because he adhered to Bible beliefs. Things like that can and do discourage us. It does me. Especially when I see how much influence this particular senator still has over other leaders and even presidential candidates. But do not forget that in the book of Esther, Haman was way ahead of this senator. Haman is way ahead of where these people are because Haman had got a law passed that was going to kill God's people. We haven't seen that yet. But maybe in some other countries around the world, but not here. But Haman was even ahead of the leaders we have now. So it was they were in a bad way at the time of Esther. They had a political leader, a governmental leader, who actually put a law in place to kill God's people. But what we saw was our God orchestrated the preservation of his people. And notice I said our God. The same God that you and I serve this morning is the same God that caused Esther to become queen. He's the same God who gave her boldness to petition the king. The same God who caused her words to influence the king. The same God who orchestrated Mordecai's rise to power. The same God who gave his people victory over the few that attacked them despite the second decree. And he is the same God who utterly destroyed the evil Haman and his entire family. Folks, this morning I say that we need to be involved. We need to vote. We need to stand for what's right in the sight of God. But should we worry and fret? These people were worse off than we were. A lot worse off than we were. We just need to simply remember that our God is on the throne, even when we don't see him, even when those around him ignore him. I think that when we get discouraged, I look at how they answered it in the Bible here. They went into prayer and fasting. Let me ask you a question. If you're concerned about our nation, as I am, and I'm sure some of you are, I've seen heads nod as I've been speaking, how much do you pray for our nation? How much do you pray for the election? How much do you pray specifically for the undecided voter out there who's still trying to decide which way to go in every election you can imagine, from local, state, and federal? There's undecided voters, and they're the ones that are going to decide the election. Between now and the time they cast a ballot, they'll flip one way or the other. Are we praying that God will influence those people? God can influence unsaved people. Look what he did to King Ahasuerus. There can be unsaved people out there that have no care for what we're talking about this morning, but God can influence them to vote to put decent government in place instead of indecent government. We certainly should pray for our fellow believers that they will vote what God would have them vote. I think God would be interested in how you vote this morning. You know, I had a guy tell me one time, we were talking about abortion, and we were talking about politics and talking about different candidates, and he told me, he says, you know, as much as I like that candidate or this candidate, I don't want to stand before the Lord when I'm being judged, and the Lord say, why did you vote for somebody that supports the killing of innocent children? He said, no matter what that candidate says he can do for us, he says, that's where I draw the line. I think that we need to encourage Christian people to vote Christian values. But I think more than anything, follow the example these folks had here in Esther's day. Pray, fast, pray specifically, pray daily, pray often, and let's pray that God will give our country another few years. Politics isn't going to save our country. We all know that. Everybody in this room, I don't care what party gets in place, politics won't save our country. Only the hand of God in people's hearts will save our country. And, you know, that's all that will save our country. But I look at it that we just keep buying a few more years by holding off the onslaught of evil people that want to take control of our country. But I'm not going to fret about it. I'm going to try to remember this story. I've studied this story closely over the last few weeks, as Larry has, tried to prepare lessons. And I've read Esther many times in my life because it's just a great story to read. Like I said, it's fun to read. But I've dug in and just looked at some of the lessons that I needed to learn. And I'm not going to fret about these things. I'm going to pray to the Lord and ask the Lord's will to be done. And then we're going to sit back and do our part, and move on. Folks, it's been great being here in your presence today. I've enjoyed it. Remember to pray for each other. Remember to send Larry your prayer requests so we can get them out to everybody in the class so we can pray for the things that's going on in our lives for each other. Remember to do that. Let's go to the Lord in prayer and be dismissed this morning. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here in person this morning. Father, it's a joy to be in your house once again. God, we do know that we're still living in health, from a health perspective, unsafe times. I pray your hand to be on this place, Lord. We have school starting back. I pray that your hand to be on the students, on the teachers. I pray you'll keep them healthy. I pray you'll keep our church members healthy. For the ones that have suffered from this sickness already, I pray that you'll bring them back to full health. Lord, we know that many have lost their lives during this pandemic. I think right now several come to mind, but one that comes to my mind in the forefront is Brother Carl Sexton. I pray for him and his family this morning. I pray for Bill Avery's family, a good layman here in our church. I remember when I was first allowed to be on the deacon board, and Bill Avery was on the deacon board, and what a joy it was to get to serve with him and have good memories of that. Lord, I pray you'll bless his family today. Lord, I pray you'll bless us as a class to do our part to pray for one another, to do our part to spread your word throughout our community. Lord, I pray you'll help us as we are in unsure times in our nation, that we'll just fall on our knees and turn to you and put it in your hands. We've seen time and time and time again in your word how you've delivered your people. Lord, we're just going to ask you to deliver our people here in this nation. Help the Christians to rally together, to stand for what's right, and to pray for one another and to pray for this nation. Lord God, I pray you'll be with our pastor. I know that he's preaching now. I know he's going to have another sermon to preach. I pray for my son-in-law, Heath, who had a little health issue this week. He is going to attempt to preach twice today down in Texas. Where they're at, I pray you'll give him the strength to be able to preach both services. I pray you'll bring him back to good health. Lord, I just pray that you'll touch us and bless us in every way as a class. We ask these things in Jesus' name.